Okay, this is Talk to Thorin, and I'm not joined by Yagami Light from Death Note. This is actually LS. You may have seen it on some of our past shows. We've done the Mount Rushmore, we've done some of the Insight, obviously. So, obviously, most of the times in the past that I've had you on shows was either in your role as kind of like an analyst, or was when you were actually a head coach of teams in the past. But more recently, I've noticed that more and more focus is being placed on the casting, because you started off as originally it was like SpoTV was doing half the broadcasts, and then the other half was the original OGN crew, and it feels like the balance over time has headed more towards where Spo's come to the forefront. So you're one of the main casters for them. That's been the last couple of years. Is this like a focus going forwards? Is being casting essentially your career at the moment?
So I'm in a little bit of a weird spot with everything. So last LCK summer was my first instance casting. I mean, I cast a few events, like super small time compared to LCK. And then I went to Worlds. I got the invite to Worlds, which I wasn't expecting. And when I was at Worlds, I remember just thinking, like, I really want to do this. Like, this is a channel or an outlet that I want to go into. Came back, I did Kespa Cup, and then found out I would be doing LCK Spring 2017. And I really wanted to make sure that the 2017 Spring split was a lot better. So I took it a lot more serious, and I took the preparation for it a lot more serious. I removed myself from playing solo queue for quite a while, and I cut down completely on the coaching and stuff. And then once the split commenced, then I gradually kept going back into, I was coaching random teams in NA and EU, like freelance. I was still doing private coaching off stream, still playing solo queue, because I think that it's really important that I try to keep up or maintain a relatively okay level of play. And then I was still doing the casting. In a lot of ways, I think I was overworking myself, probably to an unhealthy degree. But I think that the trade-off is sort of worth it. But I do plan to keep casting, and then keep doing that. So, yeah.
So when you mentioned the idea of like you want to improve your casting and make the split the best, one thing that I've always thought is a really, really overrated concept in terms of how the public sees casting is that they are so self-congratulatory if they say that someone's not good, and then later on they decide, right, now he's become good. It's almost as though like, they think they made the person good by telling them criticisms, And while obviously sometimes someone giving you some feedback could spur you on to improve in some particular respect, like from my experience of knowing people who are commentators, and some of them who started out completely fresh, and some of them are the best in the world now, a lot of it's like very subtle when you're changing casting. It's like small nuances, and actually to it sometimes even know what the person changed, you'd either have to be a caster yourself and kind of know the technical aspects, or you'd need to really know the person and kind of know what they worked on. So like what degree actually has your casting itself changed? Because basically the side point is, I've always felt like a lot of that was just people who are casual fans being a bit naive about the fact that they themselves have become accustomed to the person. They've sort of learned how they talk, right, and their style, and so it's almost like they've learned your dictionary a little bit more, and now they understand what you were saying. So how much of it's that, and how much of it do you think have you worked on specific things that you needed to improve?
So I think that moving forward, there was a lot of super small stuff that I wanted to make sure that I was cutting out. For instance, like just something that comes off the top of my head that I know that I was always cognizant about was like using and when speaking. I think that like super subtle things like you were mentioning are all that, or is all that really changes, but I guess it can make the world of difference.
So how did you stop that though?
I think I remember talking with Zyrene from Riot, and he told me, or he really stressed to me that just pausing to stall for my ability to catch up is better than saying or and that in an ideal or perfect cast, it's better than saying or
Sure. Okay.
And it's not to say that I don't still say the words sometimes, obviously, when casting, but I think that making a gradual effort to slowly try to phase it out entirely is really nice. I looked into voice lessons in early January because I know that there was a lot of people complaining about my voice, And I remember that actually made me feel horrible.
Wait a minute, they complain about your voice, as in presumably it's a bit nasal, you know, it's a bit higher. Is that what you mean? There's literally just the sound of it?
Yeah, the sound of it.
Right, okay, here's the thing.
Turn them off.
I do agree. If you could, here's the thing: if everyone could make their voice that perfect, like we have a famous accent in English, right? That is not actually, it doesn't exist anywhere in England. There's no region that has this, but it's the one that famously is associated with the BBC in Britain, right? Which is called received English, and it's a way of like, this is the BBC, welcome to, you know, like it's like a very professional sounding voice. But the whole point I'm making with that is no one in the world has that accent. You actually have to learn specifically to do that, and so that does sound very clean because everyone's heard it and it has like a sort of association in your mind, but. This is one of the areas where, to tie back into that point I said before about how people just get used to commentators, some of the most famous commentators in the world have, like, objectively terrible voices. Like, Red Eye talks to his nose the whole time, bloody hell, oh, what am I doing here? And then, like, D-Man is like, man alive, is how high-pitched is his voice. But the point is, as long as, you know, everything else is amazing that they do, yeah, we can accept that, you know, we get over it, we go, right, I've sort of tuned into that, it's not annoying. So, did you actually do the voice coaching? Is it something you think is important for you?
I did. Well, so a lot of people made the thing about like speaking from the diaphragm, but I'm an asthmatic. So speaking from the diaphragm, breathing from the diaphragm, it was always something that I already did. And that was a little bit worrisome because I guess that's something that people can pick up, but I've already been doing it my entire life. And other stuff was just controlling breath flow and how to speak, how to breathe while casting. And then obviously how to flux your voice and whatnot. I did a little bit of it, and then I did a lot of self-research because the person that I talked to basically told me that it's going to be very difficult to have any sort of gigantic change with your voice. The best thing that you can do is I give you all this information and self-study, look it up, etc. Because what you're looking for isn't reasonable relative to the complaints or whatever, because I brought up all the complaints and everything that I was worried about. And I did that, and I don't think that it actually has anything to do with the fact that the comments on my voice just started to disappear and go away. I think that it's more so like what you're saying, people just get used to it. I also think that there's a big not resistance, but there's generally a dislike attached to SPO, and so when it comes to criticisms regarding myself or my cast or whatever, it's very difficult for me to look at public criticism and then know what is genuine and what's not genuine. So for the most part, I sought out like feedback from Riot casters or other people that were in the industry, because I feel like that type of criticism would be infinitely more valuable than anything found in the public. But it's not to say that there weren't clearly some public comments, like in a Reddit thread, that was completely genuine. And I'm like, okay, this person has a real point. And so in that way, I think it's beneficial. I watched back my casts a lot, and I would think back like, okay, I should have said this differently, or I should have, done this differently, or I don't like how I sounded here. And then a lot of the big struggle is figuring out what do I do with my approach to casting, because the angle at which I approach casting is the game knowledge. Like that, I feel like that's all that I have, and I think that that's both a huge, it's a double-edged sword in a way, because if the game is really bad, for instance, it's very difficult for me to cast in a way that's not going to maybe be boring for a spectator. And the biggest struggle is figuring out a way to make it entertaining despite how bad the game is. And that's something that has thrown me completely off kilter. And I was only starting to get more comfortable with it towards the end of the split. So it's still a work in progress. I don't expect to be a miracle worker or anything in a short time span.
Yeah, well, what you're saying there actually is something that is basically like in Counter-Strike, when I do analysis work, one of the things people, this is a good example of things from the outside that a casual fan wouldn't pick up on, they wouldn't understand what you're doing when you take this approach, is that one of the ways I learned to put in like banter and jokes and to be a bit more lighthearted is I specifically, obviously my personality is sometimes I will do that if I just felt like it, you know, but that's not a very good like approach to doing it, because then, for example, you don't have it on demand, as it were. So what I did instead was I used to just, if I had something funny to say, I would figure out how serious is the match and how serious is sort of the moment in the tournament. And then I would try and balance it so that if the match was terrible and it was like low level teams and it wasn't, you know, there was not really much to get out of it without just getting unduly boring, essentially, that's when I would put in a bit more entertainment and I would take a point, but I'd make it in a more flamboyant way. I'd find a way basically to add in some show that way, because my logic there was the game didn't really provide much entertainment, so in that case I've got to kind of take up the slack there. But you go the other way, if it's the best game, I mean, if it was SKT versus KT this season, obviously in that scenario you're going to go purely into the analysis, you know. The game's going to provide the environment and you're going to be kind of that's the star in that particular sense. Has it been tough to do that then? Because like you're saying here, you have really, you know, staked your claim to like, no, I'm going to be a guy who has a very specific game analysis perspective, whereas people don't really know you for the jokes as much, right?
Yeah, well, my jokes aren't suited for, and this is something that I've talked about with some Riot casters, and I need to, I think, I don't know. I have to be careful with it. So my type of humor is dark and tasteless, which isn't suited for on-air broadcast. And so it's really difficult for me to filter myself when I'm on air, because the type of jokes that I would make, the type of jokes that or references that I would, you know, make claims to, etc. I can't do it. And so trying to find a balance inside of that and find ways that I can still angle stuff in, it has been actually really, really difficult. And moving forward with that, it's like, I don't know if I should work that angle a lot more, if I should put more emphasis into that area, or just continuously find better ways to be more concise and articulate with what I am trying to say. Because when it comes to the game knowledge aspect of casting, I feel like there's such an angle where it's still weird if the person doesn't understand the game enough for them to get what I am trying to say, because I'll make blanket statements like this team can do this, you know, they can do that, this and that. And to the average spectator, they can't move the champions around the map, like visually in their head, to understand what it is that I'm saying. And then you end up getting the Reddit threads with like, oh, LS said this about macro. And I'm like, no, we're not going to do this again. But we do it again. And it's a little bit frustrating, but I think that ultimately over time, the more that I will defend the claims and defend the criticisms and stuff. It's not to say that sometimes I can't be wrong, but for the most part, it's mostly just a misunderstanding, and I blame myself for that, for my failure to convey in a way that even, you know, a super casual viewer could understand. And I think that that's an art form that is going to take a lot of time to actually get down.
So, as you've kind of pointed out, since your emphasis is game knowledge, and it's been a very specific type, which is that whether consciously or not, you know, the approach that you've taken to being a color commentator is the idea that, like, I play the game a lot myself, and I play on the Korean ladder, we're obviously the highest level of players, and I talk to people who are pro players, and it's kind of almost trying to be like someone who's both an analyst of the game and observing it, but kind of also can directly tell you their own philosophy. So, for example, if you think a champion is more broken than the pro player does, in general, you're giving some emphasis to that. Like, oh, I actually think it's going to be, you know, in a month more broken, for example. And this is one of the areas where I think on the one hand it's good, it makes you very unique, and I think actually that's probably your strength at the moment. But the problem is that's a tougher road to kind of sell to the audience. Like, if you look at how kind of more gradual it's been that you've succeeded in this respect, part of it's because people don't always want to hear things that are like, oh, the pro player did it wrong, or everyone doesn't know that this champion's overpowered, etc. And so I know for you personally, one of the struggles has been that the kind of person who just doesn't like you for whatever reason, like you just rub them the wrong way, they're going to just kind of see everything you say in that light, as like, oh, it's all negative and he's trying to make it all about himself and his own opinions. It must be tough, right, to get through that, because obviously you've started to break through and it's starting to go well, but you can't go away from your strengths to some degree, right?
Yeah, it's mostly frustrating when people see things. I've come to realize that the casual and even slightly more than casual viewer is very result oriented. People will look at things and see a positive end result and be like, oh, that was the best play. I'm like, no, that's definitely not the best play. It turned out to be okay. I mean, Deuce 7 is going to be aces sometimes, right? All in
Sure, yeah.
pre-flop. It doesn't mean that you go all in with Deuce 7 just because it beat aces that one time. So there's a lot of situations where in draft or, you know, macro play on the map where I do know that the pro teams are making mistakes. I do know that pro players are making mistakes. And I think that comes from, again, I commit a lot of time to the ladder. When I am actively playing, I'm playing with the LCK pros, playing with bootcamp pros when they come over, whatever. And I think that that's a unique angle that I can approach from in a lot of ways. And one of the things that I also do, because I've been doing this for so long, the coaching, analyzing, casting recently as well, is when I analyze or when I coach or something, I can watch VODs in X8 speed, going all the way back into StarCraft. You know, I used to be able to watch replays in X8.
Sure, yeah.
And I can point those things out in X8 speed. I can point that out, whereas I think the normal person has to go slower, like considerably slower. And all that I see is just, you know, pieces of a puzzle basically moving around a map, and it's pattern recognition. It's like abstract algebra. And so when I'm watching it unfold real time in a cast and I'm talking about it, I guess I'm seeing what can happen based on certain positions on the map or what champions can do at this point in time and stuff. And I'll point out mistakes, or I'll be like, okay, this is less optimal. Which doesn't mean that it's not okay. It's just there's something better that could have been done. And people fail to see that refinement as something that's necessary, whereas in 2 years, it's going to be the standard. So if you pull me back in time to an iconic play like the Insect, and now we know that it's standard. You know, you have low MMR players that can pull off the Insect, but back in time, it was an iconic play that, you know, no one could really do, and Insect showcased it, etc. But if we go back and we know that it's a possibility, it's relatively simple mechanically. It just takes a little bit of practice to make work. I would criticize people for not doing an Insect. And I think that does, like you said, rub people the wrong way, because I hold things to higher standards, and if things aren't approached at a high angle or a relatively high angle, then I'm going to criticize it. And I don't see anyone do that. When I was watching casting, ever since I came into League, but even in StarCraft, I always wondered, why are they not pointing this out? You know, why are they not bringing this up? And I know that sometimes there's something that's very obvious that's happening, and it actually is, I think, a good idea to ignore it, because it's less important than something else that's happening, and so you don't get to necessarily address it. But I think in this regard, some of the things would be really difficult to see or pick up on, unless you know exactly like what is going on and why it's happening. And that's just been the angle that I guess I've tried to work, the angle that I've tried to take, because I don't think that really happens too much in casting, like across all games. I don't know how often that is something that's going to be related to a color commentator. But I have seen a lot of people say that, you know, I'm not suited to be a caster. I should just be on an analyst desk. And I'm like, well, shit, like that doesn't feel good. But I get what they're saying. But it doesn't mean that I'm not going to just continue to keep trying to refine and get better at speaking.
Okay, so one thing actually that it's funny, because we've had like full-time commentators in League of Legends for years and years now. A lot of them have like their specialty and they have an area where they're particularly good or they've become famous, you know. But I have to say, there's a lot of them I feel like who are at the top of the game, where in their areas they're still very good, but it feels like they almost think that if they just keep applying the same exact formula, then they can just that's all you need to do. No one's like pushing for some kind of extra evolution, because in League of Legends particularly, I feel like the next evolution, this is something that you, Monty, have to some degree tried to do and started trying to address in casting, is there's not really that much actual in the game analysis of macro and what should happen next and what could happen next. Like what people tend to do is they're very reactive. They just kind of explain why the team just did what they did, and then maybe they might give like a slight hint like, oh, it's possible this could. But when you consider that, especially as the seasons have gone on, the macro element, as soon as you get out of the laning phase, is the game basically. There's not very much kind of like prediction of like, oh, they need to do this more, or this is what's going to happen, or watch out. It feels like that's still a bit that's lacking, and obviously a reason why, kind of like what you alluded to here, is it's tough to get the grounding in that, and then be able to, in the moment, come up with a solid point that's not just a wild thought,
Yeah, I think that the macro element, talking about what teams can do, how they can move around the map, why they can move around the map, I think that is the most difficult by far to actually talk about. And I think that what you're talking about, I mean, there was the videos on Reddit that the pick ban predictions, right?
Sure.
that made top of Reddit or whatever. I will intentionally try to make predictions a lot, because I feel like they're not really predictions. They're like 80 to 90%.
Yeah.
Like going to happen. Yeah. This is going to happen, or it must happen, or the building blocks for this to happen currently exist, and it's more optimal than what they are doing right now. And if the people can't see the building blocks, then they can't see what I'm trying to say, but it doesn't mean that it's wrong. It just means that they lack the ability to comprehend like what it is that's going on. And I think that that's my fault, right? Because I'm not expressing or explaining what the building blocks are necessarily. But I think that that's really intriguing, as long as you can articulate it and convey it in a way that can really grasp the person's attention. Because I hate the bullshit thing of like during a cast or something, a team does something bad, and then it gets spun as being something that was good. And I'm sitting there like, no, that wasn't good. And then it leaves me wondering, do you not see the more optimal play and how that was actually really fucking bad? And it irks me in a way, because I want people to know more. I remember in my interview process to get the casting spot, I was asked why I wanted to do casting. And I said that, all the years of coaching and analysis and stuff like that, I feel like it would be a good, transition into casting. If I could find a way to make all of that stuff then form into the ability to be a caster. And I think that it can be a pretty smooth transition. And it's something that I wanted to do, because all that I've ever wanted to do in gaming was allow other people to see a higher level of play, to enjoy the higher level, or see what it is exactly that is going on. Because I think that it's art ultimately at the end of the day. Macro plays, micro plays, whatever. And so that's the whole thing there. And if I am wrong, then I learn, like, why was I wrong, Because sometimes I can make a blanket statement, or I can see something and I fail to calculate something into the equation, right? Like that is making me have the end answer. And someone will point it out, and then I can refine, and then I can learn and get better. It doesn't mean, like, saying I'm wrong is okay, but when the person doesn't drop it, that's when it gets a little bit toxic. And I think that's it. It's just going to be an endless learning process, but I do want to keep walking that road of heavy macro and heavy, micro analysis, because I think that it's the rarest thing.
Okay, so let's dive into this split of LCK. So actually, I have a question for you, which is, essentially going back in time to the beginning of the split. So I know that going into Worlds, actually, you were one of the few people I heard who was really, really up on Samsung Galaxy, actually. You weren't just like, oh, you know, they have a chance. You thought like they had great late game macro, and Crown was like, you know, I think you even like contrasted him like quite heavily against Faker, you know. And obviously by the end of the tournament, everyone magically had this opinion, and I'd always thought Samsung. It's always convenient how that works, isn't it? But anyway, by the end of the tournament, everyone thought the same thing. But that was the question coming into this season, because normally you never really get a chance to sort of run it back again, because usually teams make a change or thing. And I know obviously they did do some slight roster tweaks in terms of bringing in subs for Samsung, but they were one of the few teams that came into this split with the same exact lineup, and they essentially did just say, you know, we're going to see if we can take what we did at Worlds and be the second best team or the best team in Korea. So early on, they weren't really in position where anyone thought they were going to finish top 2 and potentially have a chance to go deep. Did you actually like anticipate that they were going to be as good against the field that had, you know, the KTs of the world, the Freecs new lineup? What was your thoughts coming into this split for Samsung Galaxy?
So Samsung, I thought Samsung was a weird thing. I thought that they would be middle high pack. I thought that they would be, you know, 5 or higher in terms of standing. But the first few weeks that I was watching them, I'm like, what the hell happened? That was my initial reaction to watching them play. I thought that they were actually really bad coming into the split. I feel like other teams had caught up with stuff that they were good at. I feel like the meta shift actually hit them in a way, because they understand late game once they can get there. But getting there, I feel like, has always been the problem for them. Understanding the mid game is something that I think that they were very weak at. And then moving forward towards the end of the split, I didn't understand all the hype entirely around them. Much like KT, I think KT is actually very bad. And it's masked by their superior mechanics, their superior team fighting. They have a lot of strengths that don't let the fact that they have a lot of shortcomings be visible. And I think that is just super interesting. This entire LCK split, especially in regard to Samsung Galaxy, was interesting to say the least, because the middle of the pack was extremely volatile. And then Samsung, I think, was so successful simply because they were less volatile, and their biggest strengths went directly against the middle of the pack's biggest weaknesses. And so it sort of ended up playing in their favor. I think that going into LCK Summer, though, they probably need to make some changes if they want to have a better run, because that's obviously the time where all the teams ramp up. You know, they get more comfortable. There's, you know, less downtime in between splits and stuff. And practice gets taken a lot more serious, right? Because Worlds is on the line. Not that practice isn't going to be taken serious in Spring Split, but obviously stuff is going to, you know, heat up in summer. So I don't know if Samsung will actually make Worlds this year, especially with if Afreeca and MVP can continue getting better. I think that Samsung's in some real danger, because if everything keeps going the way that it is right now, I don't see how Samsung takes down Afreeca and MVP towards the end of summer, just using the progression rates. Like between the teams. And, you know, the theory that Afreeca has and the roster they have and the coaching staff, etc., moving forward. So I think it'll be actually really interesting.
So even in their run to the final, and obviously one game from winning Worlds, one area I thought was really overrated in their team was their bot lane. I actually already thought you could look at that and you could even see, I mean, this is why I was amazed that H2K just put Forgiven on Sivir every bloody game, because I thought that's like the one area that a Western team could ever have an advantage. If you have a really strong AD carry and pretty decent support, that's the lane you can have the advantage in, you know. So I think we saw during this season, I mean, from my perspective, the games where they brought in Stitch and Wraith, this was a better look for them, you know. Do you think which bot lane do you think they should go? What do you think the future is in that respect?
I think that Ruler and Core JJ work out if the enemy bot lane isn't fantastic, and I think that they're more middle range, or they're more safe and stuff. And I agree with you that at Worlds, I would say that them, or at least going into Worlds, I would have said that them or Ambition would have been my worry, because Ambition's style in the jungle. I wasn't worried about Crown, wasn't entirely worried about Cuvée, even though I didn't think that he was that fantastic in the early weeks of LCK Summer. I think that obviously right now the building block around the team is going to be Haru and Crown, and then you go from there. I think that Cuvée has really stepped up a lot in recent times. But in terms of the bottom lane, I don't even necessarily know if Stitch and Wraith stay, or if Ruler and CoreJJ stay, or if you try to get another ADC. If Samsung could somehow, with that Samsung money, get a hold of Teddy, I think that would be fantastic. Because if you ask me right now to name the top 5 ADCs in the world, Teddy's actually there, even though no one talks about him. No one mentions that guy's fucking name ever. Even though he's a complete fucking monster. He's a diamond, covered in coal or something on Jin Air. But I think that the offseason will be really interesting to see if there's any sort of roster changes or player trades or player acquisitions, etc. But yeah, bottom lane has to change.
So, okay, in terms of Haru, obviously that's the other big change. It's not just that Ambition didn't play all the time. It's that yet again, we see a Korean team reach out, take a player that no one's basically heard of, and then a monster jungler. Now, this is ridiculous, because if you look in the West, any of the great junglers in the West, they've got lots of seasons under their belt. Everyone's known about them for quite a while. They also tend to rise very quickly through the scene, because I've always said support and jungle will probably always be the weakest positions in the West, because they obviously have a lot of impact also on the macro and how the team plays in general. So those are kind of, to me, the knowledge positions, which is really tough to get out of young players. So I want to get your take on this, because if this guy can just come out of nowhere, even in Korea, no one was talking about him before basically this split. And then he's had this monster performance where he's been one of the best players on the team in many of the games, and plays all the meta champions pretty much. How can it can't just be that these guys are all just bred in Korea and they're all incredible god tier junglers. There must be something more to it, because I've seen so many instances now where you take a Chaser or something like that, you put them over in the West and they look like half the player they were when they were in Korea. So what is your theory on that? How does Korea produce these amazing junglers again and again? And then is it coaching that keeps them relevant? Is it something to do with how they work with the team? Why do you think they could sort of almost lose their power when they go to the West?
I think that in Korea, top and mid are 2v2 lanes. They always have been, always will be. And in the West, it's less the case. Junglers are their own player in the West, and in Korea, again, they're attached with top and mid, and obviously bot lane to a certain degree, etc. The other thing about Korean junglers, or Korean players in general, that I've talked about many a times now, is that Korean players, even with their off roles, mid top, if you're talking about a jungler here, he can play mid top ADC and support at a challenger or near challenger Korean level, right? You won't get that out of a Western player. You just won't. It's just not going to happen. They're not going to be able to play off roles at that level of play. And that, I think, is a testament to mechanical ability and overall game knowledge to a certain extent. It's not to say that there aren't some Western players that are going to be able to do it, but for the most part, they're not going to. And so when you take a trash tier or a low tier player, it's not like you don't have anything to work with. It's just it's a lot of clay that needs to be molded in some way, and sometimes you end up having it get molded into an abomination like Longzhu's macro or something, or like Longzhu under fucking Lustboy coaching. I mean, that's some of the worst type of things that you can get out of players of potentially the highest caliber, like talent-wise. They're really, really up there in terms of skill. Haru, I think, is super interesting because he gets Crown in the mid lane, and then he gets Cuvée, who again he stepped up a lot in top lane, and then obviously the coaching staff is gonna play a part to a certain degree, but then he also has the leadership and all the experience that comes with ambition, right? So he's gonna be able to pick up a lot, and in a way, this is sort of like a mini sister team-esque, because even if teams don't necessarily have sister teams, they have trainees, right, that live at the house or that they play with the team and stuff. And this ties into it too. So they're getting a lot more experience than you're going to find in a Western organization or a Western team house, because there's more shuffling around of player dynamics. You're getting to see different angles. You're getting to talk about different things. But then on top of that,
just to kind of add to what you're saying there, I would just point out to people that if you remember, there was some screenshots leaked last year where it showed some, I think it was a Chinese team, and they were playing against SKT, and SKT had scouting. So think about that. There's no Western team would play full scrims without like Bjergsen in TSM. You wouldn't just go, oh, we'll just bring in this guy who's like a sub and he'll play the scrims. That just doesn't happen in the West, So, and to kind of like corroborate your point,
Yeah, they won't. It just won't happen. And I think that instances like that force the other players to grow more. If Bjergsen's going to obviously be inside of that scrim, then they're going to react and they're going to play around him differently. But if it's not Bjergsen, or if the player is in a position he's feeding or he's not playing that good, then it forces you to step up or think like, okay, how do we win when faced with this handicap, or not necessarily handicap, that has a really negative connotation, I guess, attached with it. But obviously that person's not able to do what our main player would be able to do. So we have to improvise. We have to figure out some ways to still win. Then when you get your main player back and you have those tools available to you, like knowing that, okay, well, this worked even with someone that wasn't as good, and it just adds to your arsenal. Swinging all the way back to why do Korean junglers get worse when they go to the West? It's really difficult to play jungle in the West. And this isn't a jungler, jungle sucks, solo queue type thing. Junglers don't know what the fuck they're doing. That's just the reality of the situation, is that most of them have no fucking idea what actually is jungle. And so you have this extremely polarizing or extremely like roller coaster type ride that junglers will experience. And when you look at it from the angle of result-based logic, then a player is fantastic or a player is shit. There is no middle ground, because they won't factor in that, okay, this mid laner actually failed the jungler. Because I've watched many scrims, I've watched many games, etc., where the mid laner fucks everything up for the jungler. The jungler does a certain route that would normally be beneficial relative to a mid laner's ability to manipulate the lane at a specific timing relative to the jungler's route. Mid laner doesn't know about that, and because he's incompetent, he fucks the jungler. That's not the jungler's fault. That's the mid laner's fault, because it's a 2v2. It's a dual lane. The jungler will get blamed for doing nothing. But it's really hard to do something when you're given shit, And so I think that that's something that it's not talked about, number one, really that much in the West, and even not so much in Korea. I mean, there's a lot of Korean dynamics that are quite bad, the lower end of LCK. But I think that that's probably going to be the most glaringly obvious thing that occurs more so in the West, is there's a lack of proper relationship between laners and the jungler.
Okay, so for anyone who isn't aware, the way the MVP for the season is decided in Korea is very different to how it's done in the West. They actually essentially have their equivalent of like player of the game, and if you get the most of them and therefore rack up the most points from this, you basically become the MVP. That's how, for example, they could have what some of them, like for example, in a Western context of sports, it would be shocking when Duke won the MVP a couple of seasons ago, because his team didn't even make the playoffs, if you remember, or they might have made the playoffs and got in the first round or something. His team was never going to win LCK, but the point is, he did get enough kind of player of the game type awards that he just was the MVP. So for this split, Crown is the MVP. He's the player who's had the most. Now, if we ignore that approach to it, would he also have been, like, using the eye test and your own perspective, would he also have been your pick for MVP for this split?
No. I really think it's Faker, probably. I know that's really cliche. I almost made a video.
But that's the problem, right? Isn't it? That Faker. This actually happens in Western sports, right? So in the NBA, LeBron James has been the best player for like a decade now, And so the problem is, because he's won so many MVP awards, it's like people look for any reason not to give him the MVP award. Like, oh, he was 2% worse, and this guy is doing pretty well. It's like, it's called voter fatigue. They just want to figure out. I want someone else to be the best. Do you think Faker suffers from that?
Faker, well, last year, I remember even talking with some riders, leading up to Worlds, like the caster bootcamp stuff, etc., that Faker was looking the most vulnerable that he ever looked in the history of his career. Okay. We come to expect an 11 out of him, and he was looking like an 8.5 or a 9. And that's gigantic, when you're talking about Faker. This split, though, I almost made a video, like a LS logic type thing called like Faker Rising, because it looked like he was back in a way. He was able to do his full-on aggression. He was able to do a lot of the things that we came to know of him throughout the seasons, and he didn't look like his LCK summer self with the way that he controlled the lane, the way that he played it, and just a lot of the stuff that he was doing. It looked like he ascended again. And I think that was much more obvious to me than Crown's play. Crown's always been a fantastic player. Crown's always going to be a fantastic player. If we want to talk about an MVP that probably gets no credit, then it would be Teddy on Jin Air. He, again, like I said earlier on, he's one of the best ADCs in the world. And no one would say that. In fact, there's going to be some fucking morons that, claim that I'm completely wrong here. Who the fuck is Teddy? Teddy's an idiot. Double lift's the best. Just wait till LCS summer. It's gonna be some fucking stupid comment, and it's just so sickening because for them to understand why Teddy is so good, they would have to first learn how to understand why he's so good, and that's just a whole fucking different ballgame.
Okay, so in terms of Crown, actually, I want to see what your perspective is on this, because the most mind-boggling thing about him is that it's not even that he did like a Smeb, had one bad split and was still a trainee and then became super good, That in itself is a little bit confusing, but also, players have to overcome nerves and learn their own style of play sometimes. But the part about Crown that is absolutely baffling to me is this fact that he was over in Brazil a few years back and he wasn't even the best player in Brazil. Actually, his team famously, they were the ones, all the teams that imported the Koreans, actually, by the way, never won the Brazilian league. They didn't do that well, and everyone was like, well, that's a failed experiment, So when he was over there as Shadow, playing for Kaboom, etc., no one ever looked at this guy like, what a god, imagine if he was back in Korea. And the reason why it's baffling to me is because, sure, his overall game has gotten very high level this last year or so, but a big thing that people look at when he's been in Korea is the mechanics are insane. I mean, you can just see when he plays, the shit he's doing, people can't do that, So right. What is your theory for this? Because usually mechanics is not the thing that suddenly goes up over the years, You don't suddenly become 3 times better mechanically. In theory, that's the sort of thing that people usually figure out earlier, and it's the style that doesn't fit them. Why do you think Crown could essentially be nobody, and now he's one of the key players in the entire world of League of Legends?
Maybe you'll get this comparison. When I think of Crown and Faker, I think of Flash and Fantasy. From StarCraft. Fantasy was, towards the end of Brood War, he was up there with Flash. Yeah. He even took down Flash. Yep. But no one was ever going to expect that because Fantasy didn't have the mechanics of Flash. He relied on, cerebral gameplay and strategy and tactics to bring down his opponents and a very micro-oriented play. But then when he took down Flash, he beat him in straight up macro games, just raw mechanics and stuff. Crown is one of the hardest workers in Korea when it comes to playing the game, learning champions, experimenting, testing. He is so just all over the place with his practice and work ethic. And I mean, if you're doing that and you're doing it with intent and you're focusing on the mechanics and you're willing to fuck up skill shots, fuck up plays and stuff, you can't help but gradually get better. And he's in a pretty big example of hard work and talent, combined, I think. I think that if Crown were to take breaks or he would slow down, he would suffer a consequence. Because that guy has just been going nonstop for the longest time ever. He doesn't even take breaks, when it's given to him. I think he's going to continue riding the wave, and then the wave will burn out when he burns out. But I don't see him burning out anytime soon. He doesn't seem like the type of personality that's going to just fade or fizzle. So I think he'll be around for a while longer. But you're right that mechanics don't normally get better, especially not at this day and age in League. You know, sometimes mechanics end up getting worse for pros. You know, they get older, they lose the ambition and, you know, the fire and passion and stuff that they have for the game, and they rely more so on their experience, their game knowledge to carry them through situations and stuff. They get into situations where they can't fail mechanically. And on the flip side, you have people like Crown and some others that are the complete opposite, and they seem to just keep getting better as time goes on. But I think that is directly associated with his work ethic and the environment that he's in.
Okay, so a team that you already slightly alluded to earlier was Longzhu, because you talked about when Lost Boy was the coach, obviously. And by the way, I've also fairly been critical. I think he's done a dog shit job as a coach. But the reason why I think this split was most shocking for Longzhu for me was when you get in a bottom lane like Prey and Gorilla, who've been so good over the last few years. And obviously, actually, the funny thing is, when Fly was first on Najin, I used to be like, right, this is one of the guys limiting your fucking team, you know. There's only so much this guy can do, but it seems like he's improved over the seasons. Crash actually turned out to be a pretty solid player, even in the train wreck Longzhu of a couple of seasons ago. Expression's half decent. Like, this should be a lineup on paper. This should be in the playoffs. Why do you think Longzhu wasn't, and why were they so underwhelming?
Longzhu is a fucking enigma. I don't know what to say about them. I mean, if you look at the organization, right, going back into other games, it's truly mystifying how they can have superstar players that manage to either get considerably worse over time or just outright just die, right? And then I'm talking about StarCraft 2, right? They had MVP, they had NST, they had Seed, and whatever. And then you go into League of Legends and stuff, and they had superstar lineups yet again, and it always came up short. And when Lost Boy was coaching them, they had macro that would have made, you know, NA and EUCS look like fucking some of the best macro teams in the world. That was a fucking abomination. In terms of like how players of that level were moving around the map and what the fuck they were doing and their approach to the game, etc. And in this split, it's the same exact thing. The mid and late game is just completely fucking absent. And they're like a watered down version of KT in some sense. And when you have Prey, Gorilla, Fly, your games shouldn't be as difficult against some of the opposition as they were proving to be. And then also on top of that, some of their drafts were just completely fucking out there. I remember, you know, making a joke, I think, during one of the casts that, you know, if you give me like a top 5 team in the LCK or something, I can, for the most part, predict their pick bans. You know, and there were some videos on Reddit about it, and that was, you know, a comment that would get brought up sometimes. When you give me like Longzhu or Rox or Kongdu, I couldn't predict shit, dude. I was blind. Like, there was nothing to do there. They were all over the place, and it has to just be the coaching staff. It has to be. I just can't even imagine it. I know that there was something that I brought up on Twitter, and I know that it was brought up not on Inven. There's another website. I can't think of the name off the top of my head. It was brought up there, and it was Fly's appearance during LCK. If you go back at LCK Summer, and you look at Fly when he's in the booth, when the camera's on him, he looks very different. When you look at him in LCK Spring, the guy looks super depressed. He's never smiling. He's never talkative. He mostly speaks with, you know, head nods and gestures rather than being vocal. And the way that he moves around the studio is it's like watching someone whose parent just died. And I know that there was a thread brought up on this Korean website, and then someone fucking replied. I don't know exactly who it was, and they're like, "Oh no, I know Fly, and this is just how he is." No, bullshit. I saw him in LCK Summer. I see him in LCK Spring. This is not the same person. Something happened, or something is happening. And then when I saw that LCK GIF of the coach speaking to Crash publicly, like with cameras on him, with like the fans watching and stuff, I'm just sitting there, and I was like mortified almost in a way, because you factor in Korean culture, right? And reprimanding and scolding and stuff is taken pretty seriously. But then to do it in public holds a more severe, a more severe reaction, I guess, to it. And And it just makes me wonder, like, what the hell is actually going on? Because it just doesn't make sense. A roster like that, having the problems that they're having, not just in gameplay, but in draft itself, I don't know what the hell's going on. It doesn't make any sense.
Coming into this split, okay, the other teams, okay, so I had SK Telecom, Samsung, KT, Afreeca. These teams, yeah, I all thought these would be in the playoffs. But the team actually that I thought Longzhu on paper should be ahead of is MVP. MVP's the surprise for me to make the playoffs. Now, I do realize that already going into last year, a lot of hype among people who are experts on the game was around Beyond. And I think actually you were one of the people, right, who was heavily invested in the idea that, you know, this is a player where just because he's not on SK Telecom, whatever, doesn't mean he's not the best jungler. I mean, he's someone who had a lot of potential. How much of MVP's performance this split is having like one of the best, if not the best jungler?
I think MVP's performance this split relative to having Beyond was big, but I don't think that it was as big as Ed stepping up. And then Max, right? So the moving into the playoffs, right? Beyond was obviously fantastic. I referred to him as like mini score in terms of like his play style, how he moves around the map, a lot of the things that he does, and his champion pool as well, like what he plays on solo queue, how active he plays and whatnot. They were looking very reminiscent of Ozone, with like how Ozone took down the big teams. They didn't have necessarily the best player at any single position, but their teamwork and their coordination and how they acted as a unit was almost like watching SKT or KT when it comes to like a team fight or something. And I think that was fantastic. And if you go back and look at the games, MVP versus KT, if not for mechanical errors, KT loses. And when I'm saying mechanical errors, KT played really fucking bad. They did. They had no macro. They made a lot of mistakes. And a lot of the fights that went their way that led to them getting major objective captures and putting MVP in an irrecoverable situation was because MVP fucked up mechanically, whether it was a missed Ash arrow or it was a fucked up engagement from them, like mechanical things that if you repeat the situation dozens of times or something, it's going to go in MVP's favor more than it would go in KT. And I think that that's fascinating because moving into summer and having Beyond, having Ed, who's stepped up dramatically in the last 6 months, and having the lineup that they do and the approach to the game that they do, I'm super fucking actually excited for them because I think that they can actually make a legitimate run or a threat for Worlds, being one of the representative for Worlds.
Okay, so the Afreeca Freecs team is one that I was really excited about when I saw the lineup announced, because it's one where, okay, the downside is they didn't have a lot of players that had actually played together before, so it is kind of like a fresh lineup you're coming in with. But there's so many players here who I always thought on some of the lesser teams were doing pretty well. Like Spirit, I even thought on Fnatic, he did the best he could, he still had times where he was a pretty good player. Obviously, Kramer's looked pretty good on CJ the last few years. I mean, there was pieces here. Kuro has always been... his problem is, I think he just started so badly on Rocks. People always kept him in that box of, just shit tier laner, never do anything liability. But as the years went on in Rocks, you could see he definitely developed his game, and kind of figured out how to do himself, how to be Kuro. And then Marin, sure, he had his problems in China, but whenever he's been put in a star position, he's been a very good player. What do you actually make of Freecs? Because on the one hand, funnily enough, it's a totally different lineup, but they did the classic thing where somehow Freecs beats SK Telecom inexplicably, and they had good players and they had moments that looked good in the split, but ultimately, nothing's ultimately come of it when you got to the playoffs. So, what do you make of Freecs all in all? Was there more potential there? Was this just like a decent team? What do you make of them?
Freecs definitely have a lot of potential, and I don't think that they're anywhere near where they're going to cap off at for sure. And I like the point that you referenced about Kuro, because he did look a lot different this split than he did in previous splits, where you just thought of him as this wave clear guy that just would not die. You couldn't kill him. And I think that he did step up to more of a middle range position while still retaining his own personality, his own identity in the mid lane. in the sense that, you know, he can actually go toe-to-toe with some people, and he'll win lane now sometimes. And I think that his champion pool also got mixed up quite a bit, and I think that that's a positive thing. I think that Freecs drafts were some of the most bizarre, especially when you consider that I Love Uve's their coach. They had a lot of drafts that had a heavy reliance on getting ahead early and then having a massive lead in the mid game to transition and suffocate the opponent. And it just struck me as very odd, especially when given their lineup, because there would still be ways to draft team compositions that would enable them to play to their strengths, most notably in the top lane with Marin, while retaining a more safe and solid mid to late transition. But they would opt out of it a lot. And then they would take extremely bizarre, like high risk, high reward type plays, or medium risk, medium reward, even though there would be no reason for it. And it really just seems like you're watching a team experiment with what they can get away with and what they can't get away with. And I think that if they find the ability to stabilize, then we'll see something that's really good. I guess an apt comparison, when you reference Uve, it's like watching Fantasy early on in his career. And I mean, that's someone that Uve coached throughout his entire career on SK Telecom, right, back in StarCraft 1. And watching Freecs reminds me of him, because if they can get everything down, if they can learn to play macro better, if they can be content with mid to late game transitions, etc., then they too, like MVP, I think, can legitimately step up a huge deal in summer and also threaten a run for Worlds. I feel like the four teams to watch in LCK Summer Samsung is not a part of it. I feel like it's MVP, Freecs, KT, and SKT are the four teams to look out for. I think that those are the four with the biggest potential, because I think that Samsung is a little bit reliant on what happens now during the spring to summer transition, and what can they do with their bot lane and their adjustments playstyle wise to keep up with these other teams that I think are more versatile in a lot more areas.
So when Marin was with SKT, he obviously got an inordinate amount of praise. I mean, a lot of people, some people were saying he was the best top player in the world. And then when he went to China, admittedly, not all his fault what happened in that team. That's been a very dysfunctional team for a few seasons now on LGD. But because he was in China, a lot of people didn't watch him, and he kind of just disappeared into the void to some degree. And now he's back, and he's played this LCK season. What do you make of Marin? Where is he at right now?
Marin, I had a lot of talks with Marin, or not with Marin, with like players about Marin, not like LCK players, but Challenger Korean players and stuff. And we all think that it's really weird how he seemingly he gets away with it's really weird. He'll do things that are illogical, but they're not illogical. He's seeing something on a much deeper level, and what I mean by that is he will do a play that most people would be, or they would claim is unsafe, right? Like, you can't do it in competitive. You can't do that play, or you can't go for this sort of a trade in lane. But he, for some reason, recognizes that I can in this instance. And because he will constantly needle in things like that, he ends up accruing CS advantages, lane dominance, superior lane position, etc., that other top laners are having a really difficult time replicating. And I think that it's so interesting and weird, not just given his age, but how he's able to do it with such different champions. He can do it on tanks, and he can also do it on, hard carries that he needs to really go off on and create enormous amounts of pressure, like his Kennen that he popularized in LCK Spring. So I think Marin gets top lane on probably a level that even the other best top laners in the world don't quite understand it in the micro aspect. I'm not convinced that he understands it in a macro aspect better than some of the other best top laners in the world. But I think on a micro aspect in the competitive game, he's more comfortable and understanding of what's happening right now than anyone else, and that's where his edge is.
Okay, right. So when we talk about KT and SKT, obviously, since they're going to be playing in the final, there's no real way to avoid it. As we talk about each of them, we're going to have to reference the other one because that's really the measuring stick for both, you know. And it was kind of set that way coming into the split because SK Telecom did a classic SK Telecom recruitment phase where everyone wants to play in SK Telecom because they think it's your chance to win worlds, you know. And so what they did is they got good players for the positions they needed to occupy again, and then the reason why the KT one was so exciting was they just did get all the big names. You know, they didn't just sign like 1 or 2 big names. They really did go for, I think, in my opinion, this is one of the only true super teams we've had in League of Legends. Like, I guess in the West, you could say it, maybe with like some of the TSM rosters, like they had a Western super team, you know?
Yeah.
But for me, a super team, this is where people always get confused. A super team is, like, for example, the Ozone team and the white team of Samsung isn't a super team because what happened is they all became the best players on that team. A super team is when you like the best players, and then you put all those guys on the same team together, and that's why it's a super team, you know. Now, an obvious flaw in the history of pretty much all team sports I'm aware of having a super team is the idea of like too many stars, and with too many stars, you know, kind of who caters to the star, who sets him up, who kind of does the things he wants to do, and who gives him the focus. With SKT's up and down split, has that been an issue here? Do you think?
Up and down in what sense?
I mean, they looked good early in the split, then they had like a really troubled period, like after the half period, and then towards the end, yeah, they're just even the results, you know, like they weren't consistent. I mean, even in terms of stars, the players that would shine weren't consistent. Like Pawn looked terrible in the middle of the split, actually got it together towards the end to some degree. So, like, has the kind of old cliche of like you can't have too many superstars, has that been part of the limiting factor? Is it something else?
Oh, I think for KT, I think that it dives deeper. There were posts on a Korean website that Smeb was early on in the middle of the split. Smeb was disagreeing heavily with Mata, and he was going out alone and drinking a lot. I guess like after scrims or something like that. This was on a Korean website. And there was a lot of problems when it came to how are we going to play the game, like in a macro sense. And so there was a lot of collision. And I think that ties in with what you're talking about, where you have all of these superstars. And then I think there's another dynamic inside of that Mata, Deft, and Pawn all come from the same family, so to speak, in a way. And so that can maybe alienate Smeb, although, you know, obviously we're not there. We're not in the house. We can't know for absolute certainty that is what's happening. And then you just have Score, who's like the solid, stable guy that you can always trust, who's just trying to tell everyone around him to shut up and play. And that basically, that's how I think about him. But I think that it's very apparent that they're not all on the same page. And Pawn is interesting to say the least in mid lane. And when you have these players that are clearly not on the same page, the way that they end up winning games is through their team fighting, through the leads that they can accrue early on. The way that they draft is a testament to how they're going to try to approach the game. But sometimes it ends up backfiring because there's only so much that you can do with an early lead. You know, sometimes teams can force you to go to mid and late game, in which KT is really weak. And when you look at almost their refusal to adapt and adjust, I don't know what is going to happen in the final against SKT. I think SKT just wins 3-0 or 3-1. I don't think there's ever a world where KT beats SKT right now. I don't know what they're going to need to do, because I think that it's a lot of internal struggle on how we're going to play the game, where are we allocating resources. And then on top of that, it almost looks like at some points Smeb, Deft, and Score are playing solo queue in a way, with like decisions that they're making. They don't look like they're operating as a unit. They literally look like the most disjointed best team in LCK.
So last year, I mean, I realize a lot of people, as you kind of alluded to before, are very results orientated. So because SK Telecom won Worlds, I noticed by the end of the year, everyone had magically rewritten history, and Faker was always the best player over the whole year. Like, for me, I give that award to Smeb. I don't think it's his fault that his team didn't win Worlds. He was the best player for me in the LCK splits, and then it's still very good at Worlds. So when you talk about this, like kind of, it's almost like a clash of philosophies on how to play the game, you know, between Mata and between Smeb. Now, obviously, they've had very different backgrounds in League. Mata was last playing in Korea like 3 years ago, you know, and obviously, again, he's someone where with Dandy, they almost like invented how to play League for the next 2 years, you know. Meanwhile, then he has to go over to China, which we know is... China's like a separate game almost there. You're not playing League of Legends in the Korean sense. You're playing, and there is like almost its own rules you have to learn to succeed in China. So he had his success there. The problem is, when Smeb was in Rocks, from early on, he was the best player. I mean, he was a fantastic player, but people talked about he has like a shot calling input, and it is clear that he kind of got everything he wanted. He's like, I'm the best player. In fact, as he kind of showed, maybe I'm the best player in the world. So let's play everything around how I want the game to go and how we'll succeed, and they did. So where do you think the clash is? Like, what? Like, does KT not play like a Smeb team? Do you think?
I don't think that they play like anything other than just trying to straight out outmuscle the opponent, and then with their leads, they make macro decisions that are enabled by their lead. And when they don't have the lead, they make the same decision. So there's no adaptation, there's no wavering on their play style. And if you look at how Smeb interacts in the team, like I was saying earlier, sometimes it just looks like he's not operating like as a unit when it comes to the macro gameplay. Obviously, in the team fighting, they're all still obviously fantastic. But I think that with Deft being on there, I think that it probably changes some dynamics that are interesting, because when you think of some of the best ADCs in the world, then Deft and Prey are both up there. So then why is Smeb having such a difference with Deft now on his team? I think that the dynamic with Score should have been more supportive for Smeb rather than Peanut. Because when you think of Score, you think of a more stable, solid jungler that doesn't necessarily have high highs, but that's because his average is already higher than most people's highs. And he doesn't have low lows. You know, you think of Score and how he plays and everything, you thought that would be better for Smeb. And when you think of Pawn, I would have thought that would have been an upgrade from Kuro. So then I think that it really does just come down to how are they playing the game, what sort of calls are they making, and what does this do to Smeb's ideology with interacting around the map and moving around the map. And it just doesn't mesh. And that's just very apparent when you watch the game.
So when we talk about Score, he's someone where I feel like every analyst like feels so bad for the guy for the last 2 years, because when he's role swapped to jungle, I mean, for me, he's the best role swap I've ever seen, because he was already a good AD carry and he had like a very defined, safe, consistent style there. But he legitimately moved to jungle and maybe became the best at the things you'd expect from the best jungler, like read the game, know how to support your team, always seemingly be in the right spot, even when your laners aren't that great. And that last part is kind of the key point, is that we always looked at him and he was the ultimate guy where it's like, it's not your fault you lost, mate. You know, you made it to the finals. You couldn't expect to win this one. And so I always felt like he was the guy who didn't get the help when he was the jungler. So on this team, he has all the weapons in the world. What is the disconnect been between him and all these powerful players? I mean, if you go back before the split and you say, right, let's take that Score, who might have been the best jungler last year, and give him Smeb, you know, you'd think you're going to go off every game, wouldn't you?
You would think that he would just go off every single game. It almost, like, I think of KT right now as like an island in a way, and everyone on it just speaks a different language. And everyone's objective is just to get off the island, and getting off the island is the equivalency of killing the enemy's nexus, right? Okay. And all that they do is they just try to find some way to get to the nexus through any means necessary. And when you think of that, it almost feels like Score is just speaking an alien language, and he's just reacting to what his teammates are doing, rather than having any sort of communication or anything funneled to him. When you watch Score in the KT versus SK Telecom series, it's really interesting how he's on aggressive junglers, but the way that he's moving around the map, it's not incorrect, but it doesn't look like he's in tune with his lane the way that you would expect a jungler of that caliber, with laners of that caliber, to be in tune. And I know that's a really blanket statement, and I feel like even a casual viewer or even a non-semi or like a serious viewer, they're not going to get that statement. I think that you would really have to be able to see the super small details on like champion movements and the jungle movements to really get that there was a visible detachment there between jungler and lane. Like I was talking about way early on, 30, 40 minutes ago, or I don't even know, about how mid and top are 2v2 lanes, and the jungler is supposed to interact. It doesn't mean that Score doesn't gank for his lanes, or that he doesn't have good gank timing, good counter gank timing, good match gank timing, etc. It's the way that he arrives at these scenarios. It doesn't look like they're on the same page, in a way. And it's a little bit troublesome to watch as well. I don't know. I don't know what they're going to do to necessarily fix that either. I think that it has to be almost a fault, like an overhaul of how they want to approach the game. Because if you look at how they approach the game right now, it's like they almost say to themselves, we must always have winning lane with an even or ahead jungler matchup. That almost looks like that is the only way that they agree to play. And I think that that can be very uncomfortable, especially if you're not accustomed to doing that. You know, it's one thing to do it sometimes. It's another to be hell-bent on it and then always do it. So, yeah.
So, okay, the interesting thing about SK Telecom is, as outsiders who don't watch LCK much will be like, oh, SK Telecom primed to win the title, no big deal there. But obviously the dynamic of the last few years wasn't that. It actually used to be that Rocks would often be in the regular season the best team, and then SKT would, they were famously fantastic in series and playoffs, and they'd come back, and that's how they'd win. So how do you compare this SK Telecom to the one that was before? Obviously only lost 2 series. How do they contrast to last year's World Championship team?
This SKT has a lot more, they have a lot more tools available to them than last year's. I think that this version of SK Telecom is way stronger for a lot of reasons. Finally, Faker has a real jungler. That's the cherry on top. And I think that it has enabled him more than, he was able to be enabled in the past. Sometimes Blank has to come in, and it lets Faker do certain things that maybe he's not comfortable doing with Peanut in certain 2v2 scenarios, or, dynamics relative to who the enemy team is or whatnot. I think that Huni's role in the team, and I think that having Prophet, who has shown that he is an extremely competent sub, is ultra effective for them. I think that because Prophet and Huni operate differently than Duke, and because Peanut is able to be that like second carry when you need him to be, and Peanut can have very, very high highs, and even when Peanut has a low, you still have Faker, so it can sort of balance that out. Whereas, I mean, if Peanut had a low at Worlds, I mean, you had fucking Kuro, so you're shit out of luck, and you end up losing to Bengi's in Italy, and that just has to feel terrible. But I think that the balance that it exists inside of their team relative to how high and how low the players can perform is super great synergy-wise. And I think that it has set them up for a run to Worlds that is going to be stronger than they've ever had in the past. So I think it's going to be really interesting this LCK summer, and obviously this World Championship, because the current form of SKT shouldn't be able to be stopped unless KT steps up big time. Because even if MVP or the Freaks step up a lot, I don't see them taking down SKT in like a best of 5, not at like Worlds or like the World Cup.
So one of the things about Peanut that I found, I feel like he's a player where a lot of fans watching LCK, I do think he actually got overhyped. In fact, I made a video about this last year, and it was called the mechanical jungler fallacy. And the basic principle was, if you're someone who is unbelievably good mechanically as a jungler, especially on like aggressive champions, the games that you go off will be so explosive that people will just be like, right, hand this guy the crown. He's just the best jungler in the world, you know. And the problem with that is, first of all, when you then have one of those meta shifts where suddenly you have to be the tank jungler, you immediately see those guys struggle because they can't do that anymore. They can't get way ahead of the enemy jungler in terms of kills and gold, you know. And then secondly, sometimes those players who are unbelievably good mechanically, it essentially covers up the fact that maybe they're not a score. They can't just read the game fantastically and know where to be and how to always support. They don't have to know. They just go there, they kill people early, they pop off, and it never matters, you know. So now that we've seen Peanut for a few years, you know, he's not as inexperienced anymore now. Now he's played a solid couple of years and he's had a lot of experience at the top level, you know. He's even been to Worlds now. Like, are there just limitations to him as a player at this point in time, or is he still heading towards becoming a more complete jungler?
Well, Peanut's how old? How old is Peanut?
I would guess like 19, but we can check.
I'm gonna check right now. I think he's 19, or he's 98, so he's almost, yeah. Okay, yeah, he's 19. All right, he just turned 19, so he's still really young. He can still definitely grow, and I think that under SK Telecom, I think that that'll be really good for him to continue to grow. So let me compare Peanut and Score, because this is a conversation I actually had with a few Korean friends recently. Peanut's, so if we're gonna use like a grade chart or something, Peanut's average is like an 8.5 or something, and Peanut's high is like a 9.5, but Peanut's low is like a 6.5, right? Score is like a 9 on average, or like an 8.7. Well, yeah, Score's like a 9 on average, and Score's high is like 9.25. So Peanut can take it a step above Score, or Peanut's high is like 9.75 or something. Like, he can just go absolutely nuts and whatever. Score's lowest low is like an 8.5. Like, Score doesn't drop. You know, he's always going to be consistent. He's always going to be there. He will never be that mega superstar like Peanut can be in certain forms. But the problem with Peanut is that, again, he's extremely volatile, and he can have a super low. He can have a mega low. And a lot of it does come down to the fact that he can read the game at like an S- level or something, like in terms of grading, right? It's not like the S+ that some junglers can read the game at, and that's the way that they remain relevant and they can stay up to par with other junglers, etc. And so because of that, he'll end up in a lot of situations where it doesn't matter that he can't read it as good as them, like you said, because mechanically he'll come out on top and then he'll ride the wave out and finish the game. The problem is where he doesn't read the game to an S or an S+ level like he needed to, then he fumbles mechanically, and then the game spirals out of control, because then he just starts making really poor choices and he never recovers from that. I think he can definitely still change. I think that it's going to take an overhaul, and that's something that's going to take a lot of time. I think of Peanut much like maybe you'll get this comparison. Do you know who like Tom Dwan is in poker?
Yeah.
The crazy. Okay, so he burst out onto the scene with crazy aggressive plays and the bluffs, and everyone loved him and whatever. It doesn't mean that he can't shift his focus, and become more stable. A lot of poker players, for instance, they can start out very ultra aggressive, super aggro, bluffs and crazy bet sizes, etc. And then as they get more experience, they gradually phase into more stable, solid, better plays. And it won't create the same level of excitement. Peanut might not get the same following that he once had or something, but I think that he can definitely transition into something that he'll be Score, or he can become Score-esque with a little bit higher of a high, and he can balance out his weak range. And if he can do that, then he'll be a fantastic jungler that'll have his own identity, that'll be a little bit different from Score.
Okay, so obviously the mid and the bottom side of the map is the one constant through all these years of SK Telecom in kind of the LCK era. What do you actually make of the SKT bot lane this split?
Well, Wolf's really good at reading the game. He's good at reading the game. He has a diverse champion pool, especially because of solo queue. He plays a lot of different things. He plays a lot of different roles as well. He is known for not liking to play support. And I think that Bang, he's just that rock, basically, in bottom lane that you can count on if you need him, to do something. He's always going to be, he's like the fucking Vegeta to Faker's Goku in a way. And having him there is obviously going to be good. In terms of bottom lanes across the LCK, they're still one of the best bottom lanes. It's always going to be, I think, like that unless something drastic changes, like if Bang leaves or if Wolf leaves. Because figuring out how do you fill that role would be really, really interesting. Because Wolf's role on the team isn't just like an engaged support that reads the game well and he's super supportive. He's also the team cheerleader in a way. He's the anti-tilt person that keeps everyone's mood afloat, and he keeps everything, the energy good and whatnot. And removing that from a team and filling it with something else could be detrimental. And then seeing how SK Telecom would play with a different type of ADC would be interesting. But there's also very few ADCs, I think, that could actually fill the role that Bang takes on. So that would be a pretty hard question to answer. But for now, they're going to be completely fine moving into Worlds. I don't think that SKT's bottom lane is in any real danger for at least another year or so.
Okay, so one of a philosophy I have in the game whenever I'm doing any of my analysis work is I am anti-hype. I actually think hype, in the most literal definition, is where you kind of take something that isn't quite that exciting or whatever, and you try and make people excited about it. So instead, I think if something's legitimately really good, then you go with the excitement route. Otherwise, you have to find a way to be more creative or just do a more in-depth reason as to why something will be worth watching. So you've already said and implied that SKT is probably going to win this final, and it probably should be easy even, because KT has so many flaws. So without just selling us a line of bullshit, give us a good reason why people should want to watch the LCK Spring Final on Saturday. What will they see? What are the good things that they could see? How could the matchup go in a way that's find me something interesting in there?
I think that you will see a desperate man try his best to break down a brick wall. I think that's basically going to be KT taking on SK Telecom. Is you're going to watch a lunatic in a mental hospital try to break out of his room, because it's, in terms of stability, there's not a lot of. It's weird, right? You talk about the telecom war and you talk about the hype and stuff. No, KT's level of play is not good. It's not it's not that good. And to say that it's going to be a great series, I don't see how that's going to be possible unless they just go straight out clown fiesta and SK Telecom slips up mechanically, and then KT gets a big lead again, and then SK Telecom with superior macros, superior mid and late gameplay claws their way back in and ends up winning. I think the only way that stuff gets hype in that series is if KT go up 2-1 or 2-0, because then SK Telecom's under heat for the very first time, basically ever in this split. And I think that it raises the real question of, does SKT with weaker mechanics across most of the lanes actually have a problem? Where their macro and their cerebral gameplay can't save them. It can't pull them out of the trenches. And that's the real question. It's going to be like watching a fucking, I don't even know. It's going to be like, Jesus Christ. I'll hit you with the anime reference, Thorin. Hold on. So, all right. Rurouni Kenshin, right? Did you ever watch that?
No, I did not.
Okay. At the very end, spoilers, there's a final battle between Kenshin and a guy named Shishomaru or something. Shishomaru is stronger than Kenshin in every single way. Every single possible fucking way. And the only way that he ends up beating him is through wits. At the final fight or the final battle or something, he does stuff that the other guy doesn't realize is a possibility. And I feel like watching SKT versus KT is a lot like watching Kenshin or like Goku fight or something, where it doesn't look like they're obviously the best, but they're not the best in the way that someone would think of the best. They don't need to dominate you in lane. They don't need to shit down your throat to beat you. It's almost like you don't realize that it's happening. You know, it's like they just slowly but surely just keep creeping onto you, and eventually before you realize that you have cancer. And there's just nothing you can do about it. And a lot of their games in LCK were that way. A lot of teams were going even with SKT to 10, 15 minutes, even gold scores, etc. And then boom, one mistake and it was all over. Because they can take an inch and stretch it a mile like no other team in the entire world. So the only hype that exists is, does KT get massive leads and get a few wins over SKT and then go up in the series and SK Telecom gets desperate and they're under pressure? That's the only way that I can get hyped about the series.
Okay, at the end of the interview, do you have a final message, something you want to shout out?
So I guess to conclude this, I guess I'll just reference my casting again. I know I'm not everyone's cup of tea, and I know that there is, a negative perception of me, especially because I come in with the Spro broadcast, and that wasn't welcomed by everyone. But I'm trying, and I take the knowledge aspect and the ability to convey info and try to make other people be able to see things and appreciate things really serious. And that's all that I really want. And at the end of the day, I am human. And this is something that I'm a part of and plan to be a part of. And so for all my shortcomings, I'm sorry, but I'll keep trying to get better.